On this day, March 1st, 1960, Dover's Colonel Everett O. Foss died at 85 years old. Colonel Foss was one of Dover's most notable citizens throughout his life. Although born in Stratford, where his grandfather owned Bow Lake, he moved with his family to Dover at 2 years old and remained a resident there the rest of his life. During his lifetime, he was known for many things, but was probably known most throughout the country as the only man to have witnessed the assassination of 2 U.S. presidents. On April 14, 1865, Colonel Foss was at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C., when President Abraham Lincoln was shot. Foss had been the last person to be greeted by the president before he took a seat for the show. Foss also knew the president's assassin, John Wilkes Booth, with whom he was staying while in D.C. In fact, Colonel Foss was one of a small group called upon to identify the body of John Wilkes Booth. Years later, on July 2, 1881, Colonel Foss was at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C., when President James Garfield was shot. Garfield would die from his injuries 79 days later. Foss recalled hearing 2 gunshots and then running to the aid of the president. He was the first person to call for a doctor. Colonel Foss, who had spent part of his career in the news business, shared a detailed account of the President Garfield tragedy with several newspapers at the time. He shared a quote from the local postmaster who saw Garfield carried past him, and who said as the president passed by, quote, "I have seen many men mortally wounded, and never with a face that more clearly showed certain death than the president's." Colonel Foss himself was no stranger to battle. He served in the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, including as paymaster in Washington, D.C. It was his war service and his assistance to the veterans of the war and their families that prompted a lifelong advocacy for veterans. For years, he offered his assistance to the widows of soldiers and sailors from his Dover home at 141 Washington Street. He traveled regularly to Washington, D.C. to advocate for veterans. During one of his trips to Washington, Foss recalled the wonder of seeing the Lusitania, of which he remarked, quote, "I was at a loss to understand how the human mind could have planned it and how the human hand could have built such a vessel." Colonel Foss also looked out for Dover's elderly. In 1898, he was credited for spearheading an effort to build the area's first rest home, the Wentworth Home for the Aged, which still operates today as the Wentworth Home. At a ceremony to inaugurate the opening of the Wentworth Home, Dover's Colonel Daniel Hall said the building was largely the result of Colonel Foss's efforts, including his lobbying of the New Hampshire legislature, which in 1883 had passed an act that incorporated the Dover Rest Home and paved the way to raise the necessary funds. It was often mentioned that Colonel Foss saw more than the assassination of 2 presidents. He also was known to have attended more presidential inaugural balls than anyone in the state. He met many living presidents during his lifetime and was only snubbed by President Grover Cleveland, who stopped in Dover while on his way, by train, to his summer home in Sandwich. Foss had asked to meet Cleveland, but was told the president was fast asleep. In noting the death of Colonel Foss, Foster's Daily Democrat said his life could be written to read like a romance because of how remarkable and varied it was. They noted some of his other achievements and firsts, including being the first person to suggest and advocate for the dredging of the Cocheco River to expand the narrows and deepen the port of Dover, a suggestion that was initially laughed at. As a newsman, he published Dover's first morning newspaper and was the first to report the news of the shooting of Elmer Ellsworth, a United States Army officer and law clerk who was the first casualty and the first Union officer to die in the Civil War. Ellsworth was gunned down while removing a Confederate flag from the roof of the Marshall House Inn in Alexandria, Virginia. Foss would be remembered as a man who, quote, "When he prospered, he was liberal with his friends, and all who came in contact with him shared his good fortune. When he was unsuccessful, it did not cloud his good nature. He enjoyed life as few people do." Colonel Foss's body would lie in state at his Washington Street home the day after his death, before it was taken to Boston to be cremated, per his wishes. Colonel Everett O. Foss is buried at Pine Hill Cemetery in Dover.